Good evening, everybody from Istanbul. I am Muzaffer, the General Secretary of Eurasian Universities Union and the Vice President of International Blue Crescent. Eurasian Universities Union is one of the biggest universities union in the world, covering around 100 universities from Europe and the Middle East and Central Asia and Southeast Asia, and it's focusing to develop the education and to develop the education capacity of the communities and also to generate networks for a better understanding, to discriminate hating between the nations, and also to help the people to develop policies to cover their educational and physical needs. International Blue Crescent, I am founder also of International Blue Crescent. It's about 20 years we are struggling in our region to cover the needs of the people under poverty problems, mainly refugees and disaster victims. Today, our focus will be on the poverty issues of the refugees and migrated people, displaced people, and we will focus on how to cover them, how to settle their problems, how to cooperate between civil society and international organizations. We have distinguished panelists today. Michel Lacharite is the emergency manager of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, one of the biggest networks worldwide, who is dealing especially on the health issues and on the Watson issues of the refugees. We have Solenne Delga from Danish Refugee Council. I will give their CVs in details during the conference. She is the head of the Danish Refugee Council Global Economic Recovery Lead. We have Nabil Ali. He is the program coordinator of IDRF-International Development Relief Foundation of Canada. We have Ignacio Baca, the executive officer of ICVA, International Council of Volunteer Agencies, and of course Metin Çorabatir, the president of the Turkish Refugee Council. Especially, we will benefit from his figures, from his information, what Turkey is facing on this refugee issue. As you know, in the world, we have about 70.6 million displaced people. 26 million of them, they are refugees. 41 million of them, they are internally displaced persons, and about 3.5 million of them, they are asylum seekers. 80% of these refugees and displaced persons, they are living in developing countries. This is a big disadvantage for the developing countries also. Half of the refugees are under 18 years old. About 25% of these refugees are women, and 4% of them pregnant women without any means to survive in the place they are living. Every 2 seconds, we have a displaced person in the world. And around 70% of these displaced persons are facing poverty problems. That means about 20 million people in the world need assistance from the local, from the government, from the international organizations, and from the civil society organizations. Before I start the panel, I wanted to give a short time to the president of Eurasian Universities Union. He wants to give some information about what we are doing, and then we start with Michel after the speech of the president of the Eurasian Universities Union. Now we have the floor, Dr. Mustafa Aydın, the president of the Eurasian Universities Union.
He's just connecting, so that if we can wait just a few minutes, and I'll ask IT again, our hosts.
Okay, thank you very much. Ben öncelikle bütün EURAS üyelerimize sağlıklı ve koronasız günler diliyorum. Hepinize hoş geldiniz diyorum bu webinarımıza.
I'll translate for our president, Dr. Aydın. He has opened his speech by saying, first of all, greeting you all and wishing you all healthy, corona-free days.
EURAS olarak biz hem bölgesel hem ülke olarak özellikle de pandemi döneminde birçok konuyu ele alarak paydaşlarımızla, üyelerimizle ortak webinarlar düzenliyoruz.
During this period of the pandemic, as EURAS and also as Istanbul Aydın University as well, we have been very active. We have been organizing many webinars on various topics related to the pandemic with all our stakeholders.
Bugün de bütün dünyayı, fakat özellikle de Orta Doğu coğrafyasını çok yakinen ilgilendiren mülteciler konusunu EURAS olarak ele alıyoruz.
So as EURAS today, we are dealing with or addressing a very important issue for the whole world, but particularly our region in the Middle East, and that is the refugees.
Hepimiz biliyoruz ki Suriye'den yaklaşık 13 milyon, yani nüfusun yarısı ortalama, o ülkedeki siyasi belirsizlikler, baskılardan dolayı kendi ülkelerini, kendi şehirlerini ve bölgelerini terk etmek zorunda kaldılar.
We know that since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, more than half of Syrian population, about 13 million Syrians, have been forcibly displaced because of political conflict, political uncertainty, and the chaos of the conflict.
Tabii ki bu mültecilerin kendi ana vatanlarını terk etmesinin birçok sebebi var.
Of course, this has many reasons why they have been displaced.
Tabii bunun başında birinci öncelik Suriye'deki demokratik olmayan, insan haklarından uzak ve tamamen baskıcı bir akla ve yönetime yaklaşan bir sistemden kaynaklanmaktadır.
So of course the first reason is the current government, the regime in Syria, which is politically suppressive and is against all human rights.
Yapılan istatistiklere göre şu anda yaklaşık 9 milyon Suriyeli mülteci güvenli olarak kendi yurtlarına dönmeye çalışmaktadırlar.
So according to research, we think that about 9 million Syrians want to return back home, depending on favorable conditions.
Burada bütün dünyaya düşen bu mültecilerin güvenli olarak, onurlu bir şekilde bütün çalışmalarını ve beklentilerini, gönüllülüklerini karşılayacak ortamın ve dönüş imkanlarının dünya tarafından bunlara sağlanmasıdır.
So what is sort of expected of the global community is to help these 9 million people who want to return to their homeland, create the conditions for these people so they can go back in a way that is safe, in a way that is honorable, in a way that they can survive.
Tabii burada bütün dünyaya baktığımız zaman Suriyeli mülteciler konusunda, tabii ki aslında yıllardan beri bütün mülteciler konusunda, ama özellikle son yıllarda Suriyeli mülteciler daha ön plana çıktığı için bunu örnek vermek istiyorum. Türkiye'nin bu mültecilere kapılarını açması, kucağını açması, halkıyla bütünleştirmesi ise çok ayrı bir özveri gerektirmektedir.
So in the recent years, Turkey has opened its doors to many refugees. Of course, the Syrians being number one. This was the most pressing issue in our region. So I want to give the case of the Syrians most importance or priority here. But Turkey has opened its doors to millions of Syrian refugees.
Şu ana kadar Türkiye Suriyeli mülteciler için yaklaşık 40 milyar dolar bir harcama yaptı.
Turkey as a country has spent more than 40 billion US dollars to take care of the Syrian refugees, to give them a sustainable presence in our country.
Bu sadece Türkiye'deki siyasi erkin bir kararı değildir. Bu aynı zamanda Türk halkının misafirperverliği, insancıl yaklaşımı, komşusu açken tok yatan bizden değildir kültürünün ve anlayışının bir sonucudur.
This is not just a political decision by the government, but this is a result of Turkish people's hospitality, their understanding, their sort of cultural notion that if your neighbor is in trouble, you cannot go to sleep in peace.
Ancak takdir edersiniz ki böyle büyük bir sosyal problemi sadece tek bir ülkenin üstesinden gelmesi veya sadece tek bir ülkenin üzerine yüklenmesinin adil olmadığını sizler de takdir ediyorsunuzdur.
But you can also imagine that such a huge social and economic problem cannot be shouldered by only one country.
Ben inanıyorum ki bu webinarla birlikte konunun sosyal, ekonomik ve siyasi boyutu detaylı ele alınarak siyasilere, farklı ülkelerdeki bu konudaki yetkililere bir ışık olacaktır.
I hope that this webinar will create a discussion, a debate about different aspects of this problem, social, economic, and political, and give a message, an awareness to policymakers around the world.
Bunun için özellikle bu webinarın hazırlanmasında ve organizasyonun yapılmasında çok büyük emeği olan EURAS'ımızın Genel Sekreteri Sayın Muzaffer Baca Bey'e çok teşekkür ediyorum.
I want to thank our Secretary General of EURAS, Muzaffer Baca, who made all the efforts to organize this webinar.
Değerli konuşmacılarımız, sınır ötesi doktorlardan Michel Lacharite, Danimarka Mülteci Konseyi'nden Solenne Delga'ya, Uluslararası Yardım Vakfı'ndan Nabil Ali'ye, Türkiye Mülteci Konseyi Başkanı çok değerli dostumuz Metin Çorabatir Beyefendi'ye ve Uluslararası Gönüller Derneği'nden Ignacio Pekır'a gerçekten şükranlarımı sunuyorum.
So I want to give my thanks, my gratitude to all the presenters today here. Michel Lacharite, Solenne Delga, Nabil Ali, Metin Çorabatir, and Ignacio Pekır.
Ben bu toplantımızın, bu webinarımızın insanlığa, mültecilerimize ve insani duygulara hitap edeceğini, yararlı olacağı düşüncesiyle bütün arkadaşlarıma, bütün katılımcılarıma EURAS Başkanı olarak saygılarımı sunuyorum.
As EURAS President, I want to again greet you all with respect and hope that this will be a fruitful discussion, something that will bring light and shed light on this important issue.
Sağlıklı ve koronasız günler diliyorum.
Again, healthy days, corona-free days to all of you. Thank you.
Teşekkür
Thank
ediyorum.
you very much, Dr. Mustafa. Thank you very much for your kind contribution you provide to the webinar, and we are welcome your thoughts, and we believe that Turkey will survive after this big refugee tragedy. Now we go to Mr. Michel Lacharite. Michel Lacharite is with MSF since 2004. By February 2020, he became the head of the emergency desk. Before was desk manager of the projects of MSF in Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Niger, and Chad. Michel will provide us with information about the MSF programs on health and sanitation for the refugees and for the internally displaced persons. And of course, we ask from him to be a little bit focused on our region, the Middle East especially. In addition, you know, this poverty problem is increased during the last year after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now it is more crucial to take care about those poverty problems of the refugees because, as we know, 168 countries have closed their borders. 90 countries, they don't accept any asylum seeker or any refugee to their countries. About 33,900 refugees have already got COVID-19, and they are the most vulnerable people in the world because they are running of means, they are running of medicine, they are running of any kind of assistance to protect themselves from the pandemic. And now it is the floor for Michel, and we would like to get his opinion about this poverty issue of the refugees worldwide, and especially in our region, the Middle East. Michel?
Okay. Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Muzaffer, for welcoming me. I'm very happy to be with you today. So I'm from MSF, and I will try to describe the MSF medical and operational response to refugees and displaced persons. And I will try to start by historical review of MSF action in the refugee camp, and then in the second step, trying to explore the current characteristics of the today's intervention. So MSF is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and we provide medical assistance to people affected by the conflict, the epidemic, natural disaster, or exclusion from healthcare. So it's a private NGO. 96% of our budget is coming from private donation, and we are about 65,000 employees. So the story of Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, and its development is closely linked to the question of refugees and displaced persons. It was through the contact of the displaced person in the camps in the 80s, particularly in Ethiopia or in Zaire, so currently the DRC, that MSF was forced to professionalize its approach. Indeed, our teams were confronted with a sudden influx of tens of thousands of people, or even more than 100,000 people sometimes. So the promiscuity in the camps that was conducive to emergence of epidemic disease, such as measles, cholera, or even diarrhea outbreak. The problem of access to food, water, sanitation, and excreta management in the camps was really a challenge. And at this moment, the mortality was extremely high. So based on this experience, MSF diversified its initial medical activity to include other components such as food distribution, nutritional care, water distribution, and sanitation. We made a step further towards the professionalization by creating our first kits in the 80s, bringing together all the medicine equipment, medical material, all together to respond to a typical and recurring situation. So these kits are still stored in the MSF supply center, so in Brussels, Dubai, or Bordeaux in France. And we have these type of kits, such as the 10,000 person vaccination kit. We have the, I don't know, the water tank 30 cubic meter kits and so on. And recently, or 10 years ago, we developed the kit of the inflatable hospital to help us to answer either natural disaster or war situation. So today, our interventions toward the refugees or the displaced person include several priorities. So the first one is, of course, the assessment or the initial assessment. Try to understand the reason of the displacement, the family composition, the livelihood, and any specificities of the population that can help adjusting the assistance. Of course, the measles vaccination is the second priority, access to water, sanitation in the camps, access to food, and so on. So we have a global response for the displaced people. The quality standard we know today were forged in the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda and the massive influx of refugees in Zaire or DRC. While we were faced with extremely high mortality, the humanitarian community as a whole and MSF in particular, we decided to better coordinate and to strengthen the quality of the intervention. So this gave birth to the Sphere project in '97, which provide a benchmark such as the number of liters of water distributed per person per day, or the quality and quantity of food, and so on. So that was the historical part. So this historical perspective, very African and not very Middle Eastern oriented, allow us to shed light on the present and to underline some contrast. Today, as Muzaffer mentioned, so there are 80 million displaced people against their will in the world. 70% comes from 5 countries, and Syria is the first one, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Turkey hosts the largest number of refugees with 3.6 million people, and the 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon make the country with the highest number of refugees per capita, with 1 refugee for every 4 nationals. So one of the patterns we face today is the transformation of camp into permanent places of living where refugees or displaced have no midterm perspective to come back home. It is the case for the hundreds of thousands South Sudanese population who sought refuge in Uganda and are stuck in camp inside the country, the Somali in Dadaab in Kenya, the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and the Syrian in Turkey, Lebanon, or even Greece. Okay, so in this situation, the mortality and the epidemic are often controlled, and the problem faced by population are also shifting. Their mental health is affected by the lack of perspective. Access to education and livelihood is limited. It is also in those situations that the role of the local and grassroots organization are key, because they can get better integrate in a more sustainable way assistance in the local landscape. Of course, in those situations, migration policies and interstate conflict negotiation are the true game changer for population welfare. So returning to MSF, despite these difficulties, we continue to provide relief to displaced persons and refugees in the Middle East, where population are older than in Africa, winters are harder, level of care and expectation of quality are higher. These elements have led us to review the standards of our intervention. For example, we have integrated a winter shelter, and it is in Zaatari experience that we encourage us, the Zaatari experience encourage us to integrate wooden shelter or container rather than tents or plastic sheeting in our range of intervention. Since the basic needs are often met, we have integrated the management of mental health or chronic disease, such as diabetes or hypertension, particularly affecting the elderly. And otherwise, we have also developed specialized surgery in some contexts. So since the camps are characterized by a problem of promiscuity, shelter of bad quality, and precarious eating system, the camps are characterized by a high number of burn victims than elsewhere. So we have developed this specialized surgery in Syria, in Iraq, in Gaza, to take care of these burn victims and to perform skin graft when it's necessary. The hospital in Amman, in Jordan, was also opened in 2006 for victims of the war in Iraq, affected by disabling and often complex injuries that cannot be treated in Iraq. They require special means and skills that are rarely available in countries whose healthcare system is fragile or destroyed by years of war. Orthopedic, maxillofacial, and reconstructive surgery, for example. The program was then expanded to include additional patients from Palestine, Yemen, and Syria for reconstructive surgery. Finally, the context of 2020 oblige us to consider the COVID on all countries of intervention. Our first objective was to maintain the action already in place, to protect our staff and patients, and to see how to provide a response to COVID as such. At the beginning of the year, we tried to reduce the transmission of the virus by distributing masks, hygiene products, and increase water distribution activities. At that time, there were very few masks for the staff, no tests, and no knowledge of proper medical management other than oxygen therapy. Fortunately, there was little transmission at the beginning of 2020, and it is only at the end of the year where the number of positive cases increased in Africa and Syria. So it cannot be explained why there are very few critical cases to date in the camps. So this is the case in Syria. And today we are looking how to contribute to the vaccination effort. So the most vulnerable, the elderly people, and most at risk, so the staff, health workers, are vaccinated before the next wave or the next outbreak. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you for the contribution provided about the health sector and about the COVID response issue. We have some questions for you, but we'll direct them to you after all the panelists complete their conversations, their presentations. And now we go to Mrs. Solenne Delga, Danish Refugee Council Global Economic Recovery Lead. We do expect from Mrs. Delga to share the DRC response framework for addressing the economic needs of refugees, including emergency response, enhancing resilience and self-reliance, and addressing root causes. Danish Refugee Council is another international NGO network who is mainly dealing with the poverty, capacity building, and livelihood issues of the refugees.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for having me today. My name is Solenne Delga, and I'm a Global Economic Recovery Advisor with the Danish Refugee Council. And today I will introduce our framework, our response framework, specifically focusing on addressing the economic needs of refugees. The presentation is divided into 3 parts with a very brief introduction to DRC, then a presentation of our response framework, and finally looking a bit more concretely about economic recovery response in different displacement scenarios. So the Danish Refugee Council was founded in 1956, and originally we responded to a refugee crisis from Hungary. But since then, our mandate has expanded quite a bit to other displacement groups. I think they've been presented before. But people that are displaced across borders, refugees and asylum seekers, people displaced within their borders, all those who are affected directly by displacement, but are not displaced themselves. So for example, the Turkish community affected by Syrian displacement. And also we look at people that are at risk of being displaced in fragile contexts. DRC has traditionally been recognized as a protection agency, and all our interventions are guided by what we call a rights-based approach. So it means promoting and ensuring the full respect of the rights of the individual in accordance with the letter and the spirit of relevant bodies of law. We work internationally. We have headquarters in Denmark, but we work across 7 regions, and I think the most relevant to this audience is obviously the Middle East, with 3 displacement crises: Syria and response in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, Iraq, and Yemen. But we also work in Asia and to provide support to the Rohingya response in Bangladesh, in Myanmar and Afghanistan, where we focus more on internal displacement and return also in the case of Afghanistan. So our response framework is a conceptual framework that aims at capturing the full spectrum of DRC's engagement with people of concern from the very beginning to the very end of their experience in displacement. At the center here, you see the people and communities that have been affected by forced displacement. These are the people we work for. The inner circle highlight the challenges that people face. They face acute crisis. There are a lot of different shocks that they can face and explain why they are being displaced, but DRC primarily focuses on main crises, specifically conflict-related displacement. I think it's been said many times before me, so I won't expand on the issues of displacement in terms of numbers, but also the duration of displacement that is increasing, where some people have been displaced for 10, 20, and even in some contexts over 40 years. And finally, the third major challenge we're looking at and try to address is the fact that it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to find and achieve durable solutions. So what we call durable solution is whether people are able to return home and reintegrate in their country of origin, or find a permanent solution in the country of displacement. So whether somebody, for example, is going to be permanently integrated into Turkey, or whether they are resettled to a third country. And these solutions are increasingly harder to get to because of many different barriers, but most of them are political and security barriers. Around this inner circle, you see another one on fragility and recurrent conflicts. That's to recognize that beyond displacement, many more people live currently in fragile contexts and are at risk of being displaced because of conflict and other shocks. And DRC also work in this fragile context pre-displacement. So this is the overall framework of how we look at refugee and displaced issues. And on the outer rings, you see our response that looks at 3 types of displacement scenario. The first one is acute crisis, so responding to emergency and providing life-saving support, very much in line with the type of support that would be provided with MSF by MSF, for example. We also look at long-term displacement. What are possible solutions within this context? Can we reduce or address displacement-related risk, and can we help people of concern achieve durable solutions? And finally, we look at addressing root causes of conflict and displacement. These causes can be many. They can be political, economic, social, cultural, environmental. And these causes, root causes of conflict, keeps producing fragility. So we look at whether there is a possibility to reduce this risk and prevent conflict and displacement. So these are the 3 lenses we apply to our response. And it's important to say it's not a continuum, and they might coexist in a specific context. I think recently in Lebanon, we've seen the need for emergency response following the blast in the port. But Lebanon is obviously a country where displacement or long-term displacement issues and the need for the search for solutions is critical, but it's also a country that is facing major financial, economic, social, and political crisis with a risk of secondary displacement. So it's really a context where we're looking at different displacement scenarios at the same time and how we can address the needs of people of concern, as well as the Lebanese population. So in our response framework, we mobilize our sector expertise to design our interventions. You can see the sectors we focus on. But today, also because it's my role, we're focusing more specifically on the economic recovery response. And before presenting more concretely the type of response to economic needs that DRC provide, I'd like to highlight some of the displacement-specific vulnerabilities which can affect the economic well-being of people of concern. First, I think it's important to realize that people who are forcibly displaced lose a lot when they leave their area of origin. They lose their productive assets, their skills. For example, they might not speak the same language as the area where they find refuge. They may also have professional skills that they cannot use anymore. For example, a farmer who will find refuge in an urban area without access to land. They don't have professional and social networks anymore. They may live in very, very poor conditions that have an impact on their physical and mental health. They may also face major legal and political barriers that will restrict their freedom of movement, for example, in closed camp policy, but also, and this is very true in the Middle East context, they will have restrictions on their right to work. That is a human right. They might not have the right to work at all, or they might have a right to work that is limited to certain sectors only, or they might not be allowed to start a business in their name, for example. So these are major restrictions that displaced population will face, specifically refugees. And finally, displaced population and refugees may be victims of unequal power dynamics and discrimination. The access of information is usually less than optimal. They may have a hard time fitting in because they have come from a very different social and cultural background. And they may also be a victim of racism and exploitation, especially with very, very poor working conditions in many contexts. So what does DRC do? I just want to say here, this is a very quick snapshot that focuses primarily on what we do and not how. And I will be using a lot of we in terms of simplification, but I think it's important to insist that DRC never works alone. We don't come in and implement without working directly with local organizations or government agencies or private sector actors, depending on what's needed. So our response to acute crisis has two major angles, I would say. The first one is to ensure that people can indeed eat, and we have different ways of providing such assistance. It can be food distributions, but increasingly we try to utilize existing markets, especially if they function. So we will provide people with cash in physical or digital forms so that they can purchase their own, whatever they need on the market. That also supports the local economy and the area where they find refuge. We also support subsistence agriculture, but that's a longer term intervention because it takes time for people to grow food and to become self-sufficient. The other part of the emergency response is to make sure that we protect and restore the livelihoods. And I will just give one example from our COVID-19 response, where really we've been supporting struggling businesses with cash transfers to help them cover their working capital, avoid dismissals, and also sometimes even prevent a full business closure. So ensuring people don't sell their assets to address the basic needs. For people who are displaced, who have been displaced for quite some time, we focus on reducing their dependency on external assistance, especially because emergency aid is not designed to sustain people for a long period of time. So here, our focus is to try to increase people's self-reliance, which means their capacity to provide for themselves and their family. And we have four main objectives. First, again, ensure that people can eat, but mostly not in the short term, have access to quality and diversified food over time. Also ensure that they can generate an income durably with very decent working conditions as much as possible. That they have access to the financial products and services that they need. And finally, and very importantly, that they are seen in a positive light by their hosts. So they are seen as contributors to their communities. So self-reliance looks very, very different depending on the context we're talking about. If you're in a rural or in an urban area, depending on the legal framework that applies to refugees, also depending on cultural links between the displaced and the host. For example, in Kurdistan, in Iraq, Syrian refugees usually find it easier to integrate than IDPs from federal Iraq because of cultural links between Karaite and Syrian Kurds. And also self-reliance will look very different, or the type of assistance we will provide will very much vary depending on the people's profile and their capacities as well. So we don't have one way of responding to this displacement risk and vulnerabilities. But we usually look at how we can support people to rebuild their assets. It can be human assets, for example, skills in language, but it can also be around building their social network, supporting them in accessing capital to start a business or expand a business. So this is really about asset development. We also help them access markets, fill in jobs that are, that corresponds to their profile. And at the same time, we work with the market actors themselves to increase refugees' access to their services and products. I'm just mentioning here the graduation approach. I don't think we will have time to go into detail of what it looks like, but I think it's important to mention this. It's a poverty alleviation model that was developed originally in Bangladesh and has been adapted to displacement context and is increasingly being used in the Middle East, especially in Jordan and with new development potentially in Turkey and Lebanon as well. And it's a model that focuses on the poorest of refugees and help them become self-reliant over time. And I will finish quickly to tell you a little bit about the response that we have in contexts where people are at risk of displacement, but haven't been displaced yet, or have come back and are still at risk of a secondary displacement. And in this context, we look at the economic causes of conflict and displacement. You can see on the screen here that I listed some of these causes. For example, major chronic unemployment, competition over resources and jobs. But this is not an exhaustive list. You can find many other causes of displacement. In this context, what we do is to focus on building community and individual resilience to possible shocks. A lot of our action is about bringing different parties and groups together, facilitate peaceful conflict management and joint decision-making for more equitable management of resources. And this comes with an increasing focus on resource regeneration, protection and regeneration in areas affected by climate change and environmental degradation. And finally, a key aspect of our work in this context is about understanding dynamics of exclusion. And we have a particular focus on improving the inclusiveness of the job market for the youth and for women. We've developed this framework that we call Young, Empowered and Safe, that basically promotes youth as positive agents of change in their community, and whereby we support youth to develop skills and income generating activities that are relevant to the development of their community, and in essence make them contributors and less likely to join armed groups or to leave their country for a different future. This was a quick snapshot of the type of information interventions DRC implements to respond to specific economic needs of refugees, displaced population, and people at risk of being displaced. I'm very happy to answer any question you may have in this forum or beyond. You can see my contact on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solenne. Thank you for your kind contributions. Let me to remind that DRC is assisting Turkish Refugee Council also to empower the capacity of the NGOs here in Turkey dealing with the refugee issues. Thank you once again for this contribution too. Now we are going to Canada. Mr. Nabil Ali will get the floor. Nabil Ali is the Director of Programs at the International Development and Relief Foundation, where he leads humanitarian and sustainable development projects across several continents. Before joining IDRF, he worked in Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia as a research consultant. During his time in East Africa, he led UNICEF's Rapid Education Project, which evaluated the overall education infrastructure across 6,000 schools. From Nabil, we are expecting to explain about IDRF policies when deciding to respond to refugees issues, crisis, priorities, and areas for urgent response, what tools they are prioritizing to overcome refugee poverty issues, and response of the local, national, and international community to appeals to emergency assistance to refugees under danger. Especially as a Muslim NGO, I would like to get this special interest on this case.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you all very much for having me. It's quite early here and I'm in Canada, but wishing you all the best. So as mentioned, my name is Nabil Ali, and I serve as the Director of Programs at the International Development and Relief Foundation. And globally, it's unfortunate, but the number of people facing hunger and the number of people that are displaced continues to be on a rise. Yet globally, we also have more resources, wealth, technology, and capacity than ever before. So this juxtaposition continues to be quite unfortunate, and underscoring a lot of the protracted nature of many of these crises is the collective failure of the international community to resolve the root causes of global displacement, generational displacement, and conflict. In many cases, the constraints on humanitarian access continue to contribute to the already precarious conditions that exist. And the refugee context has become a generational challenge, and it needs to be addressed through a new approach. The current solutions are just simply not working, and we need to honestly start talking about prevention through another lens. We need to think about prevention through the lens of really considering it through equality and through inclusion. We need to think about who's making decisions when it comes to prevention, and meaningful civil societal participation. And we really need to start building cooperative behaviors, which is fundamental to addressing the violence and sustaining peace. So for those who are unfamiliar with the International Development and Relief Foundation, we are a Canadian headquartered organization, and we're dedicated to empowering the disadvantaged people from around the world. We were founded over 37 years ago, and this started in response to the East African crisis at that time in Ethiopia, where we were really focused under refugee resettlement in Ethiopia, and then we started pivoting into Somalia at that time. And since then, as the International Development Relief Foundation, also known as IDRF, we've supported tens of millions of people around the world. We're active now in over 30 countries, and we're currently responding to some of the major disasters, such as in Lebanon, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, and many more. We primarily work in different sectors, in many of the different sectors we cover, whether it be healthcare and education, water, sanitation, hygiene, livelihood support, and in food security. And as an organization, we're dual mandated. So essentially, we do sustainable development programming, and we look at it from a long-term lens and how we can ensure that there's that sustainability component in a lot of our efforts. And then we also do our humanitarian efforts and our emergency response, ensuring that we rapidly respond and we're there. But more recently, and over the last several years, we as an organization have made a push to focus under the space of the humanitarian development nexus, and thinking about how we can, where possible, incorporate the triple nexus, which is bringing in peace, development, and humanitarian. Oftentimes, charities have, we have to work in that space. We also look at it from a lens of prioritization. So as an organization, we prioritize some of the more remote and conflicted regions, and are oftentimes dealing with issues of fragility. And we operate all of our programs through a localized approach, which essentially is looking at any organization that are on the front lines of either a crisis situation or looking at sustainable lens, and working to build local capacities. And the way in which we do that is we believe in a simple 5-pillar approach behind it. And it's really around engagement, right? So when we take that localized approach, we start by really thinking about consultation, and working with the local organizations and the local teams on the ground to understand where their needs are. And then from an information and provision standpoint, and trying to gather information and see what role we can play as a foundation, where we can provide help, and ensuring that there's that two-way form of communication, letting them know, hey, what our priorities are as a Canadian organization, where we want to go, and also ensuring that they let us know, so we're informed that we're not taking a top-down approach, but that participatory action is incorporated at all levels. Then we think about the accountability side, right? How accountable are you guys holding us, and how do we ensure that we have that level of transparency, and then participation throughout every process. And that's how we really think about engagement. But I think the larger question then becomes, how do we as IDRF think about what are our policies, right? How do we ensure that we respond to the right crises, especially at times when you are a Muslim organization or a faith-based organization, you do have your limitations around where you can do things or how you do things, and around what your donors will galvanize. So that's what I want to touch on in a moment. But before I get into that, I want to talk about what are our policies and our methodologies for how we decide to different refugee crises, and how do we prioritize areas of urgent response. So we at IDRF, we've developed a series of methodologies and policies to identify our countries of risk, and the kind of countries that are in need of humanitarian crisis. And each year we create a list of countries on our humanitarian monitoring list. So we call it the HML. And what that essentially is, it's a list of countries that we deem the most need of humanitarian service. And the way that these countries are selected is we take a very rigorous mixed method approach, both through a quantitative and qualitative analysis across the board. We first identify our selection source, and we think about who we're collecting data from and where we are getting this information. So whether that's the Humanitarian Access Overview, whether that's in ACAPS, Inform Index, the European Commission, the Council on Refugee Relations, we try to ensure that we have a really good diverse level of selection sources that are coming to us. And then we look at what are our key indicators to try to drive the decisions that we're starting to make. So if it's in disaster risk reduction, if it's in governance, institutional capacity building, physical infrastructure, we're looking at terrorism threats. We're looking at access to healthcare services, right? Especially in light of COVID. And then we follow that all up. So this is our desk review phase. And then we follow that up with connecting with our field partners. So we ensure that we have organizations that are on the ground, for instance, like IBC, and work with them to understand what are the real contexts is happening. This is the information that we have from our analysis. What is it that we need to ensure that we incorporate in our list for the year? And once we do create a list, and our list for the year, to give some context, was we had countries like Somalia, Yemen, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Syria, and Palestine, Bangladesh through the Rohingya crisis, and Ethiopia and some more. We thought about, now, how do you get your donors behind this, right? How do you ensure that as an organization, you now have the right donor engagement? So what we did is we started to really think about capacity building for our donor base. We said, hey, if these are the challenges that are happening around the world, they may not be at the top of news cycles. People may not know about these issues happening. How do you then build that capacity for donors? So we really embark on a large scale capacity building initiative where we're providing educational services, workshops, and just trainings for a lot of our donors so that they understand why it's important to support these causes and how do they ensure that happens. Because throughout the analysis that our team makes, we then eventually start to realize that, hey, there's a need here, but you may not have the resources to back it. So we need to ensure that we galvanize that. And then we do a lot of, we connect with our Canadian government as well to try to ensure that that message is amplified. So once we do have this, we then think about what is our approach now, right? So we now have figured out what it is that we want to do and how are we prioritizing those countries. We have the support from our donor base, and we've been able to galvanize them through a series of messages, whether it's engagement or actual appeals that we're making out to them so that they understand where we're coming from, and honest reporting. And I'll get into reporting a little later on. We then think about how we are actually going to be responding. So through our response, we try to prioritize both the dual humanitarian and development approach through all of our programs as much as possible. But at the heart of it is we really start to think about engaging people in crisis. So it's engaging people in crisis and then the actual service. And if we look at the engaging people in crisis component, we think about it from the very first step of provision and identifying the situation, right? So we're really trying to understand where the challenges are, who's in need, where do we support them, where are their locations, and how can you make that in a timely manner. Then we think about how do you kind of approach this more systemically. Is it through community-based initiatives? Is it through a partnership approach, right? What opportunities are you going to take, and how are you going to do this? Through either a joint design phase or implementing through response activities. And then we pivot to more direct initiatives. So if we're looking at engaging, people affected by crisis through utilizing them through labor, so we hire them in a lot of our programming, using buying their resources at a fair price and ensuring that they get market value or even above that to ensure that their accesses are there and that we're stimulating that economy and incorporating that into the programs. Then consultation and methodology is our third point. And we look at the input. We're trying to ensure that we have crisis affected humanitarian components through all of our efforts, that monitoring and evaluation is there, right? So we're factoring that in every component. And then we think about the last lens of accountability. And this is what makes it really important because we want to ensure that we're held accountable on the ground in the services we do. So when we work with our local partners, we're saying, hey, where are the services? How do we do this? Where are the challenges and where are our successes? And then communicating that back here to our donor base so that they understand exactly where are the challenges, they see the success stories, and being able to amplify both. By doing so, what you're doing is you're keeping your donors engaged, you're keeping your community engaged, and then you're giving them the ability to further galvanize when there is a challenge in the future or there are those protracted crises. And where that really comes into action is, and I want to use 3 case studies as an example around why it's important to continue to engage your donor base and why I think it's very important to ensure that you are not only responding through emergency services, but also coupling humanitarian efforts as well. So Yemen is the first one that I want to begin with. When we look at the Yemen crisis, we began responding there with our local team on the ground, IBC, and their community partners that through their engagement around saying, how do we first respond to this crisis? And we started providing food aid. And we looked at food parcels very similar to the DRC program that was previously mentioned, and ensuring that we are securing those monthly food rations and that's in alignment with the Sphere standards. And once that was incorporated and we ensured that we were providing food aid, we looked at around what are the other needs that need to be addressed. And what we decided to do is we looked at the cholera outbreaks and we started to pivot into water programming. And currently we're building over 50 solar water wells throughout Yemen. And we're not just thinking about just the water. We then connected that water programming and ensured that there are irrigation systems so nearby farmers are able to grow produce. And then once they grow their produce, they can either sell them on the open market, or we also are trying to now in our next step engage with them so we can purchase their food from them and then and then give them to families in need through our food rations program. So we're trying to create cycles, right? We're trying to ensure that we're not just providing the emergency service, but we're looking at that sustainable component. And thankfully, given our response to the healthcare services, what we did when it came to Yemen was we purchased ambulances, and our ambulances were picking up women who were expecting mothers in from really remote regions, and we're able to transport them to hospitals. But given the COVID outbreak, we now are able to ensure that people receive their treatment and testing. We've established COVID centers as well, and that was our emergency response. So we thought of, hey, well, what is that now what does that long-term sustainability lens look like in a place like Yemen? So we're currently training nurses and ensuring that we now are not only building the overall healthcare capacity, but you're also providing jobs and opportunities as well within the country. So Yemen's a good example of where, as we as an organization had to think of where the emergency component lied, and then also how do we ensure that we have that sustainable lens. In Bangladesh, through the Rohingya crisis, was very similar. We were providing a lot of food aid, and when we were on the ground and we looked at where the needs were, we saw that a lot of families were living with extended family members and dealing with various levels of trauma. They did not have adequate shelters, right? They didn't have that safety and security from a gender lens. And we know through all of the established speakers have said so far that women and children continue to be the most at risk when it comes to these generational refugee crises. So what we started moving into was shelter rehabilitation, shelter construction programs, but we took a gender lens to that to ensure that there are the right partitions that were in there, that the houses were safe and secure, and that they could also withstand the storms and the heavy weather that comes. In a place like Somalia, we looked at helping pastoralists by giving them livestock, whether it's giving them goats, and ensuring that we also had the right water infrastructure above and beyond that. So looking at it from a lens of connecting your sustainable development and humanitarian efforts allows your donors to not only see the value in the program, but also can see the sustainable change, and allows them to not only give when an emergency hits, but also support you when you have some more sustainable programming and if you draw those connections. So all in all, my remarks are not to say that we as an organization have solved the problem and to say that we know what every solution is, but we are saying that what's really, really important is that we ensure that all actors work together, that we ensure the humanitarian actors work together with the development, that where possible, we include governments and local authorities where possible, but it's not always feasible and it's not always the best approach. And then we also ensure that the number one priority that we do take when we do think about how we work and ensuring that we start to solve some of these challenges is thinking about getting humanitarian organizations more access. The more that we as a sector and all these established organizations have access to the crises, are able to develop and design programs in collaboration with local organizations, civil societies, the more we'll have some chances to grow our efforts and ensuring that we're able to better collaborate. So that does wrap up my remarks for this component of it, and I'm happy to field some more questions from everyone else as well. But I really do think that access and working in collaboration with various actors makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Now we have the Turkish case. Metin Çorabatir is the head of the Turkish Refugee Council. He will give us the Turkey approach, the Turkish NGOs approach, how we are seeing the refugee issue here in Turkey, what mechanism we are trying to develop with the international organizations. And as you know, Turkey is hosting around 3.6 million Syrians and about 1.5 million Afghans, Iraqis, and other refugees. Some of them, they are not even with the status of refugees. Turkey is the country that hosts the most refugees and asylum seekers in the world. So as the head of the Turkish Refugee Council, we would like to get the opinion of Metin about how we respond to the refugee crisis in Turkey and what we are expecting from the international community, what kind of solidarity we are looking for with the international community.
Thank you very much, Muzaffer Bey, and thanks for EURAS for organizing this. And with great delight, I hear good presentations of the colleagues who represents very experienced organizations which have global experiences in dealing with this kind of humanitarian disasters. So it is a very good teaching experience for me to listen to them. I will not try to repeat many elements that they mentioned in from different countries, the common problems. Of course, the 4 million refugees in Turkey face similar problems. I will eventually touch upon them, but I will focus on some less prioritized, but still very important issues. Before going into Turkish situation, let me briefly give some information about the Refugee Council of Turkey. First of all, I'm the president of IGAM, Research Center on Asylum and Migration, which was established in 2013. And we have done a lot of projects, mostly funded by European Union and many other international donors. In 2016, we felt an urgent need to establish an umbrella organization modeled after some well-known councils like Danish Refugee Council, Norwegian Refugee Council, Finnish Refugee Council. We attempt to establish this Refugee Council of Turkey. And now this year, or last year, we got a 3-year fund from the European Union to empower that structure. We applied for a fund together with Oxfam, IBC, and IGAM. And later on, DRC joined some of our efforts. What is our objective for this structure is that the Turkish civil society in this field of asylum and migration, forced migration, is still need to grow, to be strengthened. And the current situation is something like that. The individual organizations do not have enough power in the sense of financial sources, human sources, and knowledge-wise. So our efforts to influence the laws, legislations, the policies is not very effective if we continue to act individually as small organizations. So that is the main motivation for us to bring the forces together. Today, about 26 NGOs, some of them are refugee community-based NGOs, Syrian-based NGOs, or Afghan-based organizations, and together under the experienced leadership of Mariam Aslan, who is the Oxfam person with a large experience. We are trying to make NGOs, partner NGOs, more stronger, and to bring in more new NGOs into that umbrella, under that umbrella organization. This is the short review of the Refugee Council of Turkey. And if you look at the general situation, if you look at the whole sectors, we have a lot of problems. The Turkish government generously try to provide assistance, support, protection. Just after the beginning of 2 years after the beginning of the Syrian crisis, Turkey enacted its first ever asylum law in 2013 and established a civilian organization, but still there's a long way to go for getting a strong structure of all these system, and also the legislation also it has been appreciated by international organizations like UNHCR or European Union when it was enacted by the parliament. Still it needs serious reforms because the law was initiated much before the Syrian crisis started in 2011. It started about early 2000s when the Turkish-European Union relations were improving, and one of the preconditions for Turkish full membership to European Union was to make reforms on these serious reforms under the chapter of 24, which includes asylum law and organizational and policy developments. But when this was happening, the organizers or the drafters of the new law had one main problem in their mind, which was strongly supported by UNHCR in Turkey, which was for individual refugee cases. At that time, before the Syrian refugee crisis started, most of the case loads were individual asylum seekers from Iraq, Iran, and some other countries. But we didn't have at that time a mass influx of refugees. So Turkey was under the criticism of European countries and human rights organizations because of the gaps in its older asylum system in dealing with individual refugee cases, RST problems, refugee status determination system was not there, and there were some breaches of some basic principles, etc. So the law was originally designed to, in response to these individual refugee issues, asylum issues. And at that time, nothing was, no attention was put into the mass influx situations. When thousands and thousands of people continued to come after 2011, Turkey started to develop its own responses based on some of its historical experiences. But the new law didn't have much on this issue because, as I said, it was designed for another type of asylum problem. Now, if you look at the challenges that so many refugees are facing in Turkey, the main group, I should say that, of course, Syrians, 3.6, as one of our colleagues mentioned earlier, are Syrians, which are under Turkish temporary protection regime, but about 500,000 non-Syrian and non-European asylum seekers and refugees who are again under the international protection regime of Turkey. If you look at sector-wise, they face in each sector, despite all efforts, we have difficulties to overcome these kind of problems. Livelihood is very important issue, and we should not forget that the crisis has turned out to be a long-term crisis. We are now in its 10th year, so people are in difficulty in finding jobs, especially in registration form with social security benefits. Most of the people are working irregularly in unregistered markets, and this makes them very vulnerable, as the COVID-19 pandemic has indicated. many people lost their jobs because they were employed in the small scale shops, and their shops were closed and they found themselves out of their job and work. So finding a livelihood was very big problem, and still it is the case. Education has been impacted, although Turkey generously offered education possibilities to refugee students, young people at the school age. Still, some of them could not attend to school, partly because especially young boys cannot go to school. Instead, they have to go to work and to earn some money for their families. And now they even couldn't do that. Health service, Turkey from the beginning of the crisis offered free public health services, which is one of the sector which still, despite some problems, continue to be effective. Wherever you look at, whichever sector in the refugee situations you look at, we have problems, sufferings, and according to 3RP plans of the UN system, the large majority of the people are still live under the poverty line. These are the problems, but there are less seen problems. I mean, less the problems which are not which are abstract and will be more problematic in coming years, which is growing antipathies against refugee population, especially Syrians. This is not a particular case, you know, to Turkey, especially in Europe. In many European countries, there is a increasing number of racism, hate speech, and Turkey is not immune from that. Now, if you look at the the coming years, in 2023, we will have a general elections. There are also debates that these elections would be pulled to earlier dates. And 2 years ago, when Turkey had some local elections, the parties who used anti-refugee rhetorics were the most successful. So we have concerns that this pattern will be repeated. So refugees will be attacked verbally, rhetorically, and we know that in the field there are also physical assaults, harassments at the schools. Now schools are closed, of course, because of the COVID, but when they were open, there were peer pressures, harassments, all these negative examples were there that we experienced, observed. These are some common issues, but less visible issues, but which are also very important. And we, as the Turkish Refugee Council and IGAM, trying to get attention to these issues. After 10 years of this crisis, people are getting tired. They are psychologically in bad shape. We get some information, not systematic, because it is very difficult to make systematic research on this issue. However, we receive increasing number of complaints about domestic violence and similar issues within the households, which shows the psychology of the refugees are becoming weaker, mental health problems appears. So this is something that the international community should support Turkish government and Turkish civil society to address this kind of problems as well. Another issue is women's conditions, which is all these issues, of course, interrelated with each other. But when we work among the refugee families, refugee women, they are desperate in the sense that their life is very restrictive. The refugees are mostly living in marginal parts of the society, in poor housing conditions. So there are a lot of small children in one family unit, and women of the refugees have a lot of burden on their shoulders, and they just produce the daily life. They cook the food, care of their husband, they care their kids, nothing else. No time to get a breath, no time to go out, no time to have a free time, no time to improve their daily life, extend their interests. So this is a very important thing which increase their psychological problems. And when the women are in this difficult situation, the whole society would have a negative impact on it. There is one common, less known, less visible, but another serious problem is that the Turkish community provides definitely some support. Turkish state supports, especially in certain sectors. However, segregation and isolation is getting more and more, and which also goes together with the negative speeches, hate speeches. These people establish their own isolated islands. Syrian markets are being established. Syrian small communities have been established. So there is very little exchange, social exchange, cultural exchange between Turkish host community and refugee communities. This is something to be addressed. Last year, Turkish government announced the year as the year of harmonization, but still we are at the very beginning of this process. So this should be addressed, very serious psychological problem. They need someone to listen from the host community, ready to listen what they would like to say. This kind of structures, psychological first aid type of structures, are needed, and all these issues we are trying to address in our organization as IGAM, also in a larger scale with other partners under the Turkish Refugee Council. But at the bottom line, Turkey needs more assistance. These people stuck in Turkey, in a sense. Turkey is the final stop. There is last year's events in the Greek border, western border, have clearly showed that there is little chance for them to go to or to leak to European Union territory. The regular resettlement schemes, almost nothing. Only very, very little number of people regularly resettled. Very vulnerable people are being resettled, but for the majority, they are in Turkey under these circumstances. The 2016 Turkish EU statement is coming to an end, and we know that Turkish government and Brussels start negotiating how to extend it. The 3+3 scheme, billion euro scheme, is almost over. So we don't know what will it be replaced, how much amount. We know that the climate in Europe is not so generous now. Today, we don't expect that amount of assistance, which have to some extent the daily conditions of the refugees. But now we hope the international civil society organizations and other refugee-friendly groups should advocate for more assistance to Turkey in coming years. And also, Turkey has responsibilities to reform its asylum system, etc. These both should go together, but assistance should continue to Turkey, which really takes a lot of responsibility on its shoulder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Metin. Thank you for your contribution and the information you provided. Now we go to Ignacio Packer, the Executive Director of International Council of Volunteer Agencies. Hi, Ignacio.
Hello, Muzaffer.
After the Turkish Refugee Council, now we want to understand how it looks from European side, because most of the members, especially in the board, are from European countries. To understand the context from your side, we do expect from you to address on integrated policies mechanism between NGOs and international organizations as UNHCR, WHO, and others to respond to the poverty problems of refugees worldwide, and what ICVA role is to develop policies for the benefit of those people who are suffering, including the members in our region, you know, the ICVA members. Especially, I would like to get your opinion about the consultation meetings, how you are assisting the NGOs and the international organizations to come together and to develop such policies and to develop, to do advocacy for the governments and international organizations.
Thank you very much, Muzaffer. I'll try my best. And I find the flow of the discussion really, really interesting, starting off from Dr. Mustafa, Aydın, and then Michel, Solenne, Nabil, and then Metin Çorabatir, who really has put some of the challenges that are sent to the international community. And here I don't represent Europe at all. ICVA is rich in its diversity, by the diversity of members from all over the place. So what I would like to focus on is very much on the Global Compact on Refugees and try and tie it also with some of the discussions that have just taken place now. But I'm speaking more to a global level on how you link global international policy to the implementation and to the issues that the previous speakers have been addressing. Now, forced migration was ICVA's focus area since 1962. So ICVA has been there for 60 years, and forced migration has been one of its key elements. Actually, Muzaffer Baca heads one of the active ICVA members that we have in the region, and actually Muzaffer was a member of the board during one tenure, which we really appreciated. But just to run through, ICVA also works on issues around coordination mechanisms, which also tie in to a number of things that were discussed previously, and we try and create to help different actors operate more efficiently and effectively in relation to one another in sometimes fairly complex humanitarian coordination systems. Humanitarian financing is another key element on which we work, and a major interest for NGOs, but not only. And ICVA advocates to ensure humanitarian financing meets the needs of populations affected by crisis. And we've certainly had a surge on the requests, the type of services, and the influence that we have operated in the last year and continuing now with the current crisis around the pandemic. On forced migration, we aim to improve protection, assistance, and durable solutions for people on the move. So for refugees, IDPs, stateless persons, and migrants in vulnerable situations. And Muzaffer at the beginning reminded of the big figures also in your region. How do we do that? We do that by supporting NGOs understand, engage with, and influence. And this can be with UNHCR, IOM, and other key stakeholders, including states and regional actors. And very much on the words that I think Nabil finished with, on how important the collaboration of civil society organizations is. And this includes, of course, academics. And very grateful for the invitation from the Eurasian Universities Union to participate in this conference. And I recall in 2015 in Istanbul, October 2015, Turkey was hosting the Global Forum for Migration. And my peers chose me for that following year as chair of the civil society. So I had the opportunity of addressing the statement for civil society, and on which there was a strong insistence on how migration policy is built on two pillars. One is on the evidence, and that's where we do need, of course, not only academics, but also the stories, the real things that are happening in the ground, the lives of people, and then values. The values that are enshrined in a number of documents on to which we adhere, and our governments also have adhered upon. And that's why I wanted to focus a little bit of the attention and run through the Global Compact for refugees, where it started and where we are now, and mainly to try and illustrate how engagement of civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, academics, and others can enter into there to look and to better inform on international policy discussions, but also better equip organizations at country level to be able to be discussing also with different stakeholders, including with the governments. The Global Compact on Refugees, as you would remember, in 2018 was overwhelmingly endorsed by member states at the UN General Assembly. And many of the elements that came out on the previous contributions, but mainly what Mr. Metin Çorabatir touched on, are in the intentions of the Global Compact on Refugees. It aims at establishing a framework for responsibility sharing on refugee issues, and as a means for protection, to strengthen protection and expand durable solutions for refugees worldwide. It also provides a basis to catalyze multi-stakeholder partnership and leverage humanitarian and development actions to promote refugee self-reliance. And in here, there are put in place periodic reviews and stock-taking elements on which I would take a little moment to dive in and to try and indicate where perhaps your organization, and some of you are already in there, can contribute, but also learn to bring that back into the discussions with the different stakeholders in which you are involved. In the lead to the adoption of the compact, compact, well, ICVA played a very important role. I'm not going to go through it, but there's just been an external impact study on ICVA's work, and it has very much highlighted how ICVA for the NGO community has played an important role in bringing analysis, bringing views and opinions from different contexts, and bringing it at the right levels to do some influence in finally what is a policy, what is a text, and which is not yet, of course, implementation. And that's where I would like to take you now with a few minutes I have left. You may also remember, and this is part of the Global Compact on Refugees, that in December 2019, there was the Global Refugee Forum. The region was particularly represented because President Erdogan went to Geneva for this Global Refugee Forum, which led to over 700 pledges. And Turkey was one of the co-hosts of this major event. It was a major event, and it comes every 4 years to take stock and to see what are the pledges that are being taken. And it's important to monitor what pledges have been taken. And that is part of the work that ICVA does with its members, and really encourage others to join on the discussion, to make sure that the pledges that come from countries, they come from the private sector, they also come from civil society, from NGOs, from academics, are being implemented. And this certainly is the follow-up which at ICVA we gave in many different ways, in establishing briefings, in organizing webinars, learning sessions, but also through our regional hubs, so our teams in the regions. And for the MENA region, we have a team in Amman, also to engage in the discussion, and also play this convening role, whether it be, and very often it is, with UNHCR, but also with IOM, can also be with the World Bank and other stakeholders. ICVA also works in a collective way to bring different statements at key moments of the discussion. And these statements are collective, so that means that they reflect, and sometimes reflect, the diversity of opinions of the NGO community. Just to give you an idea, in 2019, there were about 20 high-level collective statements that were issued through ICVA. Not necessarily ICVA speaking, it can be one of you speaking, because many of you probably have not heard of ICVA, and that's because we are the kind of organization very much that serves the members and prefers seeing the light shed on our members and not necessarily on us. Those at some moments when it is, because it is a collective voice, it's important that ICVA be present. Now, if I may take another 2 minutes, I would like to insist on what's coming up in 2019. Mid-December 2021, time goes by really fast now, we're already in 2021, yeah. The high-level officials meeting, that's something which is part of the Global Compact for on refugees, and which takes place every 2 years, while the Global Refugee Forum is every 4 years. And this is the high-level officials meeting, and the first one will take place on 14th and 15th of December 2021, so end of this year. And it is an opportunity to take stock of progress and maintain the momentum towards achievements of the objectives of the GCR. And here again, and you're welcome to contact ICVA During the year 2021, we do offer different opportunities and for collective statements that are made towards the member states, opportunities of discussions with UNHCR, looking at the progress of the different pledges, whether through the regional hub of ICVA or then more centrally on our global level. So certainly I wanted to illustrate with one element which is really important to keep in mind, this global compact on refugees. Many of the topics that have been discussed on an operational level are rooted in there. The only difficulty is that it's around the implementation. We have pledges, we have to follow those pledges. And this comes from someone that, well, most of my career I've been an operational person. I haven't been in corridors and so on. So you can imagine how I'm an impatient person when there are discussions that just go on, and you have the feeling that they're slightly disconnected from the reality, which is your reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio. Let's go to the question and answers. And the first question comes to you before you leave the floor. We got a question says, what action steps can we take to push the politicians to increase economic support to refugees, especially in pandemic times?
Yes. We are trying to push a big element which is embedded in the culture that you described of the MENA region, which is sometimes disrupted, but it's the one of solidarity. But that discussion at the level of the solidarity amongst donor governments. So we work a lot with a good humanitarian donorship, which groups 40 of the 40 major donors of humanitarian financing, and how important it is that the flow of funding does go as rapidly and as efficiently as possible to the frontline workers. How we can see that the cash programs, even if we have coordination issues around that are increasing with elements of quite an important impact on livelihoods for the refugees. These are just...
The other question comes to Michel Lacharite. Michel, vaccination started worldwide, especially in the European Union and United States. I mean, in the rich countries. I got a lot of questions about vaccination campaign in poor countries, especially on refugees and displaced people. What the international NGO community can do in order to provide vaccination and protection against the pandemic to the refugees?
I think it's a very good question. So today, if we take the situation of Syria, we look very closely to see how many vaccine and which vaccine will be channeled through North Syria. I understand that today there is something like 20% of the population or the target population that can be covered by vaccine. As of today, we don't know if the vaccine identified is already homologated, where it's supposed to come from, and so on. But there is some actors who are willing to fund it. On our side, I think we can assist because there is a complexity in terms of cold chain and mechanism. So this is something that we can assist, not necessarily to implement the cold chain, but to see how we can ease, because we are experienced in this one. I think the second point, the discussion on identifying who are the first or priority target population is one of the other good questions that we need to see. I believe that today, if we look at the access to healthcare, every staff or frontline worker who gets sick is access to healthcare that is less for the population. So I believe that the old people, people with comorbidity, and the health worker staff might be prioritized. So this is a discussion that we would like to have with local actors. And after we'll see how we can engage. And I believe that this is the same situation in different countries, but really looking at what are the justification and target, prioritarian target, and after to look as well at the logistics issue if we can assist.
Thank you, Michel. A similar question to Solenne from Danish Refugee Council. You know, during the pandemic time, unemployment is one of the main troubles that the developing countries are facing now. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs, and now they are, even the local communities are under poverty problem. In such condition, what do you think about what mechanism must be used in order to promote, to solve the poverty issues of the refugees, especially the displaced people? How we can create jobs to them when people are losing, the local people are losing their jobs?
Thanks. I think it's a very important and obviously a very, very complicated question. I think it's really great that Ignacio talked about the Global Compact, because there are a lot of reflection in terms of implementation of this compact, of what exactly that looks like in a situation where you have major hosting situation, when you support refugees, and how you make sure that you support host communities at the same time in an equitable manner. I think as part of the pandemic, we've seen very interesting progress towards incorporation or alignment, at least, of some of the humanitarian social protection mechanisms and the national social protection mechanisms. Some countries have made major progress towards incorporating refugees into their own social protection systems. But I think I think you said very well, it does come with the reflection around the fact, or the thinking around the fact, that it has to consider the poverty, unemployment, structural issues that are affecting the host population as much. And I think there is a major shift in the humanitarian community to be much more open and understanding of these issues. We cannot talk about refugee response without considering the poverty issues and the structural issues that exist in the hosting countries. I don't have a good answer in terms of what exactly needs to be put in place. A lot of what we've been doing is trying to make sure that there are safety nets in place, both for the refugees and the people that are hosting. So as I was saying, we try to protect small businesses. We try to ensure that everybody has access to this type of support. But we are quite limited in the type of resources we have. And one of the key points for us is to ensure there is an equal treatment that is provided by the states themselves. And we apply these principles to our response as well. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Solenne. Thank you. A question to Metin related with the Turkish government policy regarding the refugees and asylum seekers. During the pandemic era, is this policy changed? If it is changed, what are the signs of these changes? And if it is not changed, what you are expecting from the Turkish government to take care about the refugees problem during the pandemic era?
Well, the main components of the asylum policy of the Turkish government is the same. But the pandemic creates a new circumstances, new challenges. Unfortunately, not only the central government, but also the big municipalities, which were won by the opposition parties, there was a general lack of interest in distributing the aid. Turkish institutions, governmental or municipal institutions, provided assistance to local people, masks, free masks, or other food or in-kind assistance, cash assistance. But unfortunately, refugees in general got the less benefit of it. This is one issue which scares us for the future. There was a clear kind of discrimination against these populations who are in need of international protection. Another issue is that, of course, as the local people did, many refugees who have been earning their livelihood through unregistered jobs. Most of them, they lost jobs. So as a result, these people do not have social support systems because they are families living alone. So there's no bigger families to support the ones who are in difficulty. So housing turned out to be a bigger problem. When they were able, one or two family members were getting salaries, they were supporting and paying the rents. But when the jobs were lost, the landlords, after some months of tolerance, started to push them to pay or to leave the houses. It turned out to be a housing problem. This was another way that refugees influenced. But on the positive side, these people were very careful. They were very keen, very attentive to all announcements to keep them away from this pandemic. They observe all the rules put by the government, all measures to clear their, wash their hands and put distances. It was amazing that they were very keen to observe these preventive measures, which was the positive side, and show their resilience and their how they strongly keep them into life. So they deserve more support, I think. Of course, education sector, the kids at the school ages have negatively influenced because some of them did not have enough cellular phone or internet connection. When the whole education turned to be visual, these who do not have these instruments couldn't have education. Now the measures were taken. For example, they can go to the schools and get the internet connections. It is becoming better, but visual education created another problems. They couldn't understand the lectures of the person, the teacher in the television who speaks quite fast, adapted to the Turkish audience. And the kids could not be able, refugee kids could not be able to ask questions if they couldn't understand and if they need further explanation. So in this sector also they have been influenced. These irregular migrants, most of them are Afghans. Since they are not registered, they refrain to go to hospital until the latest moment because they fear that they could be identified and then after treatment they could be returned back to their country of origin. So this case load is different. It has also negatively influenced differently.
Thank you,
Yes.
Metin. And my last question to Nabil. It's a strange question, sorry for that. One of the participants asking, you are campaigning to Muslim communities with what is the response of other religious communities? How do they respond to your campaigns?
That's a great question, actually. I kind of find that pretty interesting.
Yeah,
I would say, what I would say to that is, so we're faith inspired as an organization. We're Muslim in that sense, but across the board, we actually get quite a bit of support from many different religions across the board, right? So and that is the reason why we do that, and how we get that support is really because of the fact that we operate, you know, secularly. All of our programs are secular. Anyone from any religion, ethnicity, background across the board, we never discriminate in any of our efforts. So because of that, we're able to galvanize and get a lot of support from anyone in all sectors. And so in a sense, like our foundings are faith inspired, but our work is, you know, without discrimination or any, and on all efforts on that base. And we do that under the humanitarian principles and whatnot. So that's how we operate, and that's how we've been able to get so much support. For instance, even when we came to COVID, we saw that we're getting a lot of support from many different organizations, many mainstream organizations, and then the government. And that was because we've always entrenched ourselves and been able to grow our efforts in such a way. So yeah, that's how we've been able to do it, and we've gotten a lot of support. And we also support many other organizations that are faith inspired as well, many different Christian organizations and whatnot. So it's being able to kind of, you know, ensuring that, yeah, faith-based approaches may be how organizations raise revenue or get donations, but when it comes to being able to implement and galvanize and support one another, that you leave all of that at the door, and you ensure that you approach it from a lens of putting the people you're trying to help at the center of it, and coordinating in such a manner.
Thank you very much, Nabil. And we will publish it in the YouTube channel of Eurasian Universities Union. Thank you very much to all my colleagues who have participated and for their great contributions. And I hope to continue such webinars in the future. Thank you very much.